The
We
alien
made it
warrior
through.
should have been
You're
dead.
safe now.
Her armor hung in shattered pieces.
Always.
Ceremonial warplate that had
We
drunk
made it through.
starlight for
You're safe
centuries now split open like broken promises.
Always.
Silver scales etched with constellation patterns lay scattered across black glass ground, each piece reflecting a sky that didn't belong to Earth. One shoulder was gone entirely, torn away by weapons designed to harvest rather than kill. Blue blood leaked down her side, iridescent and slow, pooling in the ash like liquid sapphire. But she stood. Kira Velsharn, captain of the Starborn Vanguard, warbound of the Calathar Covenant, kept one knee locked and the other barely holding. Her blade arm, that elegant fusion of bone and living metal her people were born with, hung broken at her side. The weapon that had carved through a dozen battlefields now reduced to a jagged shard no longer than a dagger. Around her, 5 hunters circled with the patience of carrion birds, who knew their meal was guaranteed. The Titan's Edge battlefield stretched silent in every direction. What had been a thriving lunar colony just hours ago was now a graveyard of melted infrastructure and cooling bodies. The morning sun of the planet below bled red through the thin atmosphere, turning everything the color of old wounds. Smoke drifted between broken hull plates and shattered defense towers, carrying the smell of burned ozone and extinguished lives. Kira's tactical display had gone dark 20 minutes ago when the last of her unit fell, 12 warriors under her command, each one trained since childhood, each one bonded to her through oaths older than human spaceflight. Now they were data points in a battle report no one would ever file. The hunters weren't military. Their armor told that story clearly. Patched with trophies, decorated with teeth from a dozen species, painted with kill tallies that would make regular soldiers vomit. These were collectors, professionals who made fortunes harvesting the exotic, the rare, the powerful. And a Calathar warbound captain, still breathing, was worth more than most colonies. The lead hunter raised his shock spear, the tip crackling with blue electricity. His voice carried through external speakers, distorted and amused. Calathar commander. Your armor alone could buy a mining station. Your blade genetics? He laughed, the sound hollow inside his sealed helmet. Priceless on the black market. Makes this almost too easy. Kira's fingers tightened on her broken blade shard. Her vision swam from blood loss, but her mind remained crystal clear. The warrior's calculation ran automatically, mechanical as breathing. 5 targets, 2 carrying shock weapons designed to paralyze without killing the merchandise. 3 with collection tools. Surgical instruments meant to separate valuable parts from bodies that might still be conscious during the process. Her effective combat capability, maybe 30%. Her chance of taking them all, statistically 0. But Calathar did not kneel in death. Kormara Vihal, she whispered in her native tongue. A warbound dies standing. This is the way. This has always been the way. She shifted her weight, preparing for the final rush that would take 2, maybe 3 of them with her. Not victory, just defiance. Just one last gesture proving that some things couldn't be harvested, only destroyed. The lead hunter drew back his shock spear, savoring the moment. Then the world turned white. An industrial foam canister burst midair between them, expanding into a spreading net of quick-hardening compound. It slapped across the hunter's helmet and weapon with the sound of a wet blanket hitting stone. The foam hardened instantly, sealing his visor, locking his joints, turning him from predator to statue in half a heartbeat. The hunter stumbled, suddenly fighting his own equipment, clawing at his face with hands that wouldn't respond properly. Kira's head snapped toward the source of the throw. A human, male, unarmored, wearing a civilian rescue contractor's jumpsuit that had seen better decades. He was already moving, sliding across the glassified ground like someone who understood exactly how foolish this was and had decided to do it anyway. His face was set in the expression of a man who'd made a terrible decision and would see it through regardless. In his hand, another canister. He threw a magnesium flare directly into the nearest hunter's visor. Red-white light washed across the battlefield, retina burning intensity that turned shadows into knives. The hunter flinched, reflexes overriding training. And in that moment of blindness, everything changed. The human didn't stop running. He came straight at Kyra like she was the objective. The only thing that mattered. A rescue target instead of an alien warrior who'd killed more experienced soldiers than he'd probably ever met. He grabbed her wrist. His hand was warm against her cooling skin, calloused from tools rather than weapons. Strong enough to support but not restrain. The touch carried no dominance, no claim of ownership, just contact, just connection. "Can you walk?" His voice cut through the chaos, direct and practical. No translator needed to understand the tone. Pure assessment, zero ceremony. Kira stared at him. Her combat-trained mind tried to process what was happening and failed to find categories. Humans didn't walk toward Calathar warriors. They negotiated from distance, fought from cover, or ran from threat. They didn't charge into active combat zones to grab the hand of someone who could snap their neck with casual effort. His eyes met hers, human brown against her violet glow, and she saw no fear there. Concern, yes. Urgency, absolutely. But not the terror that her kind usually inspired in his species. "Can you walk?" he repeated, already pulling her toward a ridge of twisted metal where shadows offered something resembling cover. Kira tried to take a step. Her leg buckled immediately, muscles shredded by wounds she'd been ignoring through combat trance and sheer stubbornness. She pitched forward. The human caught her before she hit the ground, moving with reflexes that shouldn't have been fast enough. The impact drove air from his lungs in a grunt, but he held firm, taking her weight with the kind of whole-body mechanics that spoke of experience, hauling things heavier than they looked. He was shocked by two things immediately: how light she felt under the armor fragments, her species built for speed and precision rather than mass, and how hot, like her blood was burning from the inside, her core temperature running degrees above human normal. A hunter lunged from the side, opportunistic and silent. The human didn't look. His peripheral vision caught the movement, and his body responded before conscious thought finished processing. He released Kyra's wrist and swung his heavy cutting tool in a brutal arc. No technique, just momentum and desperation. Metal met helmet with a sound like a bell being struck wrong. The hunter dropped, unconscious or dead. Neither of them had time to check. The human's hands vibrated from the impact, bones screaming protest up his arms. But he didn't drop the tool. He turned back to Kyra, and for the first time since the battle began, her expression shifted from pure tactical rage to something sharper. Confusion. A human. Unarmored. With no clan markings she could identify. No military designation. No reason to be here. Standing between her and death like it was a reasonable choice. Like species loyalty mattered less than the simple fact that someone was dying and he could maybe stop it. He pulled her arm over his shoulder with surprising gentleness, given the circumstances. "Okay," he said, voice rough but steady. "Don't die on me. I'm not carrying you twice." The broken translator in Kyra's failing armor caught fragments, turned them into approximations. The meaning came through more in tone than words. "Stay alive. We move together. Don't quit on me." They moved, not fast, not clean, but they moved. Behind them, the remaining hunters regrouped, their initial confidence replaced by rising anger. The ugly certainty that their prize was slipping away mixed with a professional calculation of how much effort a single human was worth versus the value of the merchandise. The human pulled Kira through a quarter-mile of twisted wreckage, using debris as shields, forcing their pursuers into narrow lines. When a hunter fired a pulse shot, he kicked a loose plate into the beam's path. The energy deflected into scorched ground. When another rushed them, he yanked a hanging cable and sent an engine casing swinging like a pendulum, catching the hunter mid-run with the inevitability of physics. Glass plane, junk maze, simple geometry turned into tactical advantage. Kira watched through pain-blurred vision. This wasn't warrior combat. This was survivor thinking, using environment as weapon, turning every obstacle into opportunity, unconventional, improvised, effective. They reached an emergency pod half buried under scrap metal, its hull rusted and pitted with age. One seat, meant for solo evacuation, not meant for two, barely meant for one. The human slammed the hatch open with his shoulder and pushed her inside first. No hesitation, no self-preservation calculation. Kira resisted, grabbing his sleeve with sudden strength that surprised them both. Her fingers locked on the rough fabric with the grip of someone who'd spent their entire life being the protector, not the protected. Someone for whom accepting help required rewiring fundamental identity. Her eyes searched his face, desperate and furious, trying to communicate across species and situation, trying to understand what kind of creature throws themselves into death for a stranger. Then she spoke. One word, harsh and musical, carrying weight that transcended translation. Kira. She pressed her hand to her chest, the gesture unmistakable. Her name, her identity, the thing she was offering in exchange for this incomprehensible rescue. The human blinked, processing. Then understanding crossed his features. Something almost like a smile. Garrett, he said. He tapped his own chest. Garrett Ashford. Kira pressed 2 fingers to his sternum, hard enough to feel his heartbeat through the jumpsuit. The gesture was a question in her culture, a demand for acknowledgement, for witnessing. Garrett held still, accepting the touch without flinching from its intensity. Garrett Ashford, he repeated, slower, making sure she heard each syllable. Her pupils widened slightly, the violet glow flickering, like the sound mattered, like she was recording it into memory alongside combat data and tactical assessments. Outside, footsteps crunched closer across broken glass. The hunters had regrouped, spread into a search pattern, closing the net with professional efficiency. Garrett shoved himself into the pod with Kyra, physics arguing against the possibility. Half on his knees, half twisted sideways. His spine bent at an angle that would hurt for weeks if they survived the next 5 minutes. The hatch wouldn't close, not with both of them crammed inside a space meant for one. Warning lights blinked red across the ancient control panel. Pressure seals failing, life support compromised. The pod was designed to keep a single person alive for a short emergency flight. 2 meant neither would make it. Garrett's jaw tightened, mind racing through options that didn't exist. He grabbed the foam seal canister from his belt, the same industrial compound he'd used to blind the first hunter, smashed it against the hatch frame and sprayed the edges while forcing the door down with his shoulder. Body weight and desperation against mechanical resistance. The foam expanded, hardened, welded the seal shut, messy, imperfect, held together by hope and chemistry, airtight enough for a short run, maybe. The pod rattled as weapons struck the outside. A shock spear slammed into the hull, denting metal, the impact resonating through the cramped space like being inside a struck drum. Kira lifted her broken blade shard, the instinct to defend hardwired so deep that injury and exhaustion couldn't suppress it. Garrett shook his head, placing his hand over hers, gently pushing the weapon down. No, if that opens even a crack, we're done. She stared at him like he'd insulted her honor, like he'd suggested a war-bound hide from threat. Her entire body language screamed protest. Every muscle tensed against the idea of passivity while danger pressed close. Then her gaze flicked down to his hands, scarred from years of technical work, to the foam seal, crude but functional, the kind of solution that shouldn't work but did, to the emergency welds holding the pod together through nothing but improvisation and refusal to accept failure. Something shifted in her expression, recognition rather than trust. This human wasn't strong like a warrior. He was dangerous in a different way, the way of someone who survived by thinking faster than problems evolved, by turning every disadvantage into leverage. The pod shuddered again. Another impact, closer to critical failure. Garrett reached for the manual thruster lever, ancient mechanism that screamed liability in 3 languages. Hold on, he muttered, more to himself than her. His eyes caught the fuel readout. Critical, almost empty. They had 1 burn, maybe 2, if he was creative and lucky. Fuel's critical, but if I dump life support reserves into the thrusters. He started rerouting systems with desperate speed, fingers flying across the interface, the kind of problem-solving he'd learned growing up in Tennessee, where fixing things yourself wasn't frugality. It was necessity, where you learned to make do with what you had because what you had was usually all you'd get. NASA had tried to train that out of him, wanted procedure over improvisation. He'd left before they succeeded. We get 1 burn, 1 chance at controlled descent instead of ballistic death. The pod shuddered as non-essential systems died, their power redirected to engines that coughed once before catching. He yanked the thruster lever. The pod lurched forward, scraping through wreckage with the sound of tortured metal. It smashed past broken plating, bounced off a support beam, and burst into open space with all the grace of a thrown brick. Behind them, the hunter's silhouettes shrank to black specks against the red horizon. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like they'd made it. Then the pod's console lit up with a message written in the universal language of imminent death. Fuel depleted, trajectory unsafe, life support compromised. Garrett exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his voice through sheer stubbornness. All right, we try something different. Kira's breathing grew rough. Each inhale visible effort. Her blood soaked into the pod's floor, pooling in corners, shimmering like spilled starlight under the emergency lighting. The iridescent blue looked beautiful in a way that made Garrett's chest tight, because he knew what it meant. She was dying. Slowly but certainly, and he had maybe 20 minutes to figure out how to stop it with equipment designed for human biology and hope that somehow translated. Her eyes stayed on him, not pleading. Calathar didn't beg, but watching, measuring, recording this human who'd pulled her from death and now sat in a failing pod already planning their next impossible survival. Then with effort that made her shoulders tremble, she reached up and touched the side of his face. The gesture was strange for a warrior, almost gentle. Her palm rested against his cheek, fingers cool despite her species' elevated temperature, her touch carrying intention beyond comfort. She spoke again, several words this time, low and urgent, the sounds flowing like water over stone. The pod's dying translator caught fragments, struggled to parse grammar in context, finally spat out broken text across the cracked display screen. Chosen, bound, mate. Garrett froze, his entire body going rigid with a sudden certainty that he'd missed something crucial. That cultural context he didn't understand was shifting beneath his feet like unstable ground. He looked at her, really looked, past the armor and the blood and the alien features, at the intensity in her eyes, the absolute conviction in her expression, the way she held his gaze like she was issuing a battlefield command that would reshape everything. What? His voice came out strangled. What did you just... Kira's hand pressed firmer against his face, making sure he couldn't look away, couldn't pretend he hadn't heard. She spoke again, slower this time, each word deliberate. The translator had enough power left for one more attempt. Text scrolled across the screen. Clearer now, terrible in its clarity. I claim you. Life debt sealed. You are mine. Garrett's mind went blank, then flooded with questions, protests, confusion that had no framework for processing what was happening. Outside the cracked viewport, the horizon tilted as the pod's trajectory degraded, and sliding out of the clouds above, silent and perfect, came ships, sleek vessels that drank light instead of reflecting it, their hulls covered in the same constellation patterns that had decorated Kira's armor. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military formation, dozens of them appearing from nowhere like they'd been waiting just beyond sight. Calathar warships, a full fleet response. They weren't chasing the pod, they were pacing it, matching velocity, waiting. Garrett's mouth went dry, understanding clicking into place with the weight of a death sentence. Those ships had responded to Kira's distress beacon. They were coming for their commander, their war-bound captain, their warrior who represented something important enough to deploy fleet assets. And she had just claimed him, bound him, called him mate in front of whatever cultural framework her people operated under. He looked at Kyra, this powerful alien bleeding in his lap, who had just made him part of something that could get entire worlds burned. Kira, he said carefully, voice tight, what exactly did you just do? She met his eyes, fierce and certain, her expression carrying zero regret. Saved you, she said, the translator finally catching up to real time. As you saved me. The pod screamed as it tore through the upper clouds, metal vibrating, warnings multiplying across every functional display. The moon rushed up to meet them, barren and hostile, its surface marked with impact craters and ancient ruins. Garrett braced one hand against the wall and the other against Kira's shoulder, keeping her stable as gravity twisted sideways and physics stopped making promises about their survival. The Calathar ships maintained formation above them, neither helping nor hindering, just watching with the patient inevitability of judgment, delayed but never forgotten. Garrett had spent his entire adult life around danger. He'd worked disaster sites, pulled survivors from wrecks that should have been coffins, walked through situations where one wrong move meant death. He understood risk. He understood probability. But this was different. This wasn't mechanical failure or natural disaster or even hostile fire. This was cultural consequence, political ramification, the kind of danger that didn't kill you fast but reshaped your entire existence until you weren't sure which would have been preferable. The moon's surface filled the viewport, gray and unforgiving. "All right," Garrett said again, gripping Kyra tighter as impact approached. "We survived the next 60 seconds. Then we figure out what the hell you just dragged me into." Kira's lips moved. Might have been a smile, might have been pain. Hard to tell with alien features and approaching unconsciousness. "Tell Kareth," she whispered. "Life bond. Cora Vesto." The translator gave up, too damaged to parse. But Garrett heard the certainty in her tone. She'd claimed him, bound him, made him hers, and somewhere above them, a fleet of ships that could reduce planets to asteroids was waiting to see what humanity's newest and most unwilling diplomat would do about it. The pod hit the moon's surface at velocity that made mockery of safety ratings. Metal tore. Sparks burst like dying stars. They tumbled twice, the world spinning into chaos before slamming to rest against a ridge of ancient stone. Then silence fell like a held breath. Garrett didn't move for a long moment. He waited for pain to arrive, for his body to inform him which parts were broken beyond immediate repair. When nothing screamed louder than bruised ribs and a shoulder that had popped back into place during the tumble, he exhaled carefully. He checked Kyra, still breathing, still unconscious, still dying at a rate he needed to address immediately, or none of the cultural complications would matter, because there'd be nothing left to complicate. "Welcome to nowhere," Garrett said to the unresponsive alien warrior in his arms, his voice rough with adrenaline crash and dawning horror at what the next hours would bring. He kicked the hatch loose with effort that sent pain lancing through his leg. Cold air rushed in, thin and metallic, tasting of dust and ancient ice. The moon's atmosphere was barely thick enough to breathe, just sufficient to keep them alive while it slowly killed them. The sky stretched pale and empty above, the planet they'd fled hanging low on the horizon like a watching eye, and higher, almost invisible against the stars. The Calathar fleet maintained position, waiting, watching, judging what happened next. Garrett hauled himself out of the pod, every muscle screaming protest. Then he turned and lifted Kyra carefully, grunting as he took her weight again, cradling her like she was precious rather than dangerous, like she was someone who deserved gentleness despite being able to kill him a dozen different ways, even in her current condition. She leaned into him without resistance, head against his shoulder, unconscious trust from a warrior who'd spent her entire life being the strong one. That told him more than words ever could, showed him exactly how badly she was hurt, how close to the edge she'd come. He found shelter under a stone overhang not far from the crash site, a space that offered protection from the thin wind and direct line of sight to anyone approaching. His training kicked in, hands moving on autopilot born from too many disaster sites and emergency extractions. He cut away the damaged sections with his multi-tool. Each piece came away reluctantly, as if the ancient metal itself mourned its failure. Beneath the armor, her skin showed patterns he hadn't expected, crystalline structures that pulsed faintly with internal light, running along her limbs and torso like circuitry designed by something that understood both biology and art. The patterns flickered weakly, synchronized with her heartbeat, growing dimmer with each breath. Garrett sealed the worst wounds with medical foam from his emergency kit. Technology designed for human injuries applied to alien biology with the desperate hope that basic principles of stopping blood loss translated across evolution. He monitored her breathing with instruments meant for his species, watching readouts that made no sense, trying to extrapolate meaning from patterns. Her pulse was too fast, her skin too warm. Nothing lined up with human baselines. But she lived. That was enough for now. Hours passed in fragile quiet, marked only by the slow movement of the planet across the sky and the occasional flicker of Kira's bioluminescent patterns. Garrett sat nearby, working on a section of the pod's communication array he'd salvaged, trying to jury-rig something that might let them signal for help without immediately painting a target on their position. His hands moved through familiar mechanical processes while his mind spun through implications. She'd claimed him. Whatever that meant in Calathar culture, it carried weight. Enough weight that a fleet had responded. Enough weight that his life had just become infinitely more complicated than pulling people from wrecks and trying to stay invisible in a universe that ate the noticed. Garrett thought about the convoy burning around him, about pulling Kira from certain death, about the choice he'd made without thinking, the pattern he'd followed his entire life. Choose right over safe. Choose principle over convenience. It had cost him everything before. NASA, military service, every stable position he had ever held. But he'd never regretted it. Not really. Above them, the Calathar ships continued their patient vigil, waiting for the human who'd saved their commander to decide what kind of person he would be when the universe demanded an answer. When Kara finally woke, it wasn't with groaning or confusion. One moment unconscious, the next her eyes open. Violet glow focusing immediately on Garrett with the alertness of someone trained never to show vulnerability. She watched him in silence for several heartbeats, not like prey studying predator, like judgment assessing evidence. Garrett kept working on the communication array, giving her space to orient, to remember, to decide how she wanted to handle waking up in shelter with a human who'd seen her helpless. "You could have left," Kira said suddenly, her voice lower than before, steady despite the pain that must have been coursing through every nerve. The translator in her partially repaired armor had enough power to function now, turning her words into something Garrett's ears could process. He paused his work but didn't look up. "Yeah, could have. When the hunters fell, when the pod failed, humans retreat when odds turn against them." She stated it as fact, not accusation, simple observation based on tactical profiles her people maintained on every species they encountered. Garrett set down his multi-tool, finally meeting her gaze. "Some do," she waited, the silence carrying expectation. Garrett sighed, the sound carrying decades of complicated history. "My job is saving people who don't get saved. If I start choosing who deserves it, I stop being useful. Stop being me." Wish Kira considered them, her expression unreadable. "Then you knew I was dangerous." "Still are," Garrett agreed. "Yet you stayed." "Yeah." Her gaze sharpened, intensity increasing. "Why?" Garrett finally looked directly at her, and the honesty in his face carried the kind of weight that didn't need translation. "Because you were still fighting. Because dying alone is the worst way to go. Because walking away would have felt like cutting out part of myself." He paused. "And because sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same. And I got tired of always picking smart." That answer seemed to strike something deep inside Omar. Kira shifted, wincing as damaged muscles protested. But she pushed herself upright despite his gesture of protest, sat facing him with the posture of someone who wouldn't be kept prone, wouldn't accept the vulnerability of lying down when serious words needed speaking. "You misunderstand my words earlier," she said carefully. Garrett felt relief flood through him. "Good, because I was real confused about the whole mate thing. I claimed Telkareth, life bond. This is sacred law among my people." The relief evaporated. Garrett opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Okay, going to need you to explain that, because the translator gave me mate, and that seemed like a pretty big leap from thanks for the rescue." Kira's expression remained serious. No hint of amusement at his discomfort. When one saves a warbound on the edge of honorable death, when they intervene without thought of reward or claim of dominance, they become Telkareth. "Bound by choice," she paused, making sure he understood. "By my choice, Umbao." Garrett's stomach dropped. "Bound how?" Her eyes didn't waver. "In all the ways that matter. Protection, truth, loyalty, partnership." The word hung between them like a bridge neither had asked to cross. Garrett let out a breath. "Okay, that's intense, but I didn't save you for that. I didn't save you for anything except—" "I know," Kira interrupted, and there was something almost gentle in how she said it. "That is why it matters." That shut him up completely. She continued, voice calm but carrying enormous weight beneath the surface. "The Calathar are not merely warriors. We are shields, symbols. If I return alone, wounded with my escort dead, The council will fracture. Hardliners will claim human aggression. Moderates will lose ground. Garrett's stomach tightened as implications cascaded. And if you don't return, the Iron Claw faction will crown a puppet leader. They will harvest my people's worlds for resources. Kira's jaw set. Then they will come for yours. Garrett stared at her. Why Earth? Why would they? Because humans survive, Kira said simply. The observation carrying no judgment, just tactical assessment. You adapt, you endure, you resist being owned or controlled. That makes you valuable allies. Her expression hardened. Or threats that must be eliminated before you become problems. Garrett laughed once. Bitter sound without humor. You should see our history. We're better at eliminating each other than anyone else manages. I have seen your history, Kira replied. That is part of why I chose you. That word again. Chose. Before Garrett could respond, his salvage scanner chirped. Soft warning. Multiple heat signatures cresting the ridge in the distance. Moving with tactical spacing. Not hunters. Soldiers. Disciplined. Armored. Organized and human. Garrett's blood ran cold as recognition set in. He knew that formation pattern, had seen it during his brief military service years ago, before he transferred to civilian rescue operations and tried to find meaning in saving rather than destroying. They followed me, he muttered, pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Kyra was already on her feet, swaying but upright, broken blade appearing in her hand like she'd summoned it from nothing. Her bioluminescent patterns flared brighter. Combat readiness overriding injury through sheer force of will. These are not raiders, she said, eyes narrowing as her own sensors parsed the approaching formation. They carry command frequency gear. Earth standard military encryption. Garrett felt something crack inside his chest, like the last piece of innocence finally breaking under the weight of evidence. No, that doesn't make sense. I'm a civilian contractor. Why would... The soldiers approached in clean formation. Weapons lowered but ready, visors reflecting the pale sky like mirrors designed to hide humanity behind. Their armor was new, well-maintained, marked with insignia Garrett recognized from news broadcasts and government press releases. Terran Strategic Command, the people who decided Earth's official position on alien contact. The organization that technically had no jurisdiction over civilian contractors, but somehow always seemed to be around when things went wrong. Their leader raised one hand, the universal gesture for halt, for parley, for this doesn't have to get messy, a voice called through amplified speakers. Female, professional, and sickeningly familiar. Garrett Ashford, by order of the Terran Strategic Authority, you are to surrender immediately. Garrett's blood froze. He knew that voice. Captain Brenna Caldwell. 3 years ago, they'd pulled survivors from Ganymede's collapsed tunnels together. She'd grown up in Montana, military family, talked about the mountains like they were sacred. She'd been different then, compassionate, someone who gave a damn. Whatever she'd become since wore her face but spoke with someone else's words. Garrett stepped forward before Kara could stop him. Before she could position herself between him and the threat like her instincts were screaming she should. I'm a civilian, he shouted back, voice raw with betrayal and dawning understanding. A contractor. You don't have jurisdiction here. This is disputed territory. The soldier paused, helmet turned slightly, like consulting with someone off-channel. Receiving orders or confirmation or permission to speak truth that changed everything. Then Caldwell said words Garrett would never forget, delivered in the flat professional tone of someone reporting facts rather than consequences. You were never meant to survive the convoy ambush, Mr. Ashford. The truth hit harder than any physical blow, harder than the pod crash or the hunter's weapons or the certainty of death he'd faced on the battlefield. Because this was different. This was intentional. This was his own people, his own species, treating him like expendable ammunition in a war he hadn't known he was fighting. Behind him, Kira's grip tightened on her broken blade, the sound of living metal responding to her rage carrying clearly in the thin air. You were bait, she said quietly. Voice iron, a spark to ignite conflict. Garrett's hands curled into fists, knuckles white, every muscle trembling with the effort of not screaming or collapsing or doing anything except standing upright, while his worldview restructured itself around this new terrible center. The soldiers advanced, weapons still lowered but fingers resting on triggers. The international language of, "We'd prefer not to, but we absolutely will." Kira stepped to Garrett's side, not in front, not behind, beside. Equal positioning, partnership stance. "You saved my life," she said, voice carrying certainty that cut through confusion and betrayal like blade through flesh. "Now I will save yours." Garrett glanced at her, seeing the determination in her alien features, the absolute conviction that transcended species and circumstance. "You're in no shape to—" "I am warbound," Kira interrupted, lifting her chin with fierce pride that injury and exhaustion couldn't diminish. "And you are Telkareth, mine to protect, mine to defend." Caldwell's voice came again, closer now. "Stand down, Ashford. This doesn't have to escalate." Garrett's voice cracked with bitter laughter. "Escalate? You sent me to die, Brenna. You knew. The whole convoy, the medical supplies, the rescue contract, all of it was theater." Caldwell's helmet tilted slightly. Not denial, just assessment of how much he'd figured out. "The Calathar female is a strategic asset," Caldwell said, her tone flattening into pure military efficiency. "Command wants her intact. You're a complication we can't afford." "Asset?" Kira repeated the word, her translator turning it into something that carried all the contempt she felt. "You reduce warriors to merchandise." "Everything's merchandise if it keeps Earth ahead of the curve," Caldwell replied. No apology, no shame. Just the cold mathematics of empire wearing a human face. Garrett felt rage boil up, hot and sharp, cutting through the betrayal and fear. "She's not property. She's a person who almost died because you people decided her death would be politically convenient. And her survival, bonded to you, creates different opportunities." Caldwell's weapon raised fractionally, the movement carrying implicit threat. "Which is why you're going to step aside. Let us handle this professionally, and maybe live long enough to spend whatever they pay you for silence." Kira looked at Garrett then, not asking permission, asking understanding. Her violet eyes held a question that transcended language. "Do you stand with me, or do you step aside when convenience demands it?" Garrett had spent 32 years learning to survive by staying invisible, by not making waves, by being useful without being noticeable. Every instinct screamed at him to step aside. Let the professionals handle things above his pay grade. Go back to pulling people from wrecks instead of getting buried in political consequences. But he'd also spent those same years watching people in power make decisions that turned human beings into acceptable losses. Watch them smile while filing reports that reduced tragedy to acceptable percentages. He'd left NASA because they wanted him to sign off on safety violations. Left military service because orders stopped making moral sense. Kept leaving every time someone tried to make him complicit in treating people like numbers on balance sheets. He was so damn tired of leaving. Garrett reached into his pocket slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. The soldiers tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. He pulled out a data chip, one he'd taken from a soldier's armor when he'd stripped their gear during the initial confrontation. "Before we do anything dramatic," Garrett said carefully, "I think everyone should know what's really happening here." He plugged the chip into his wrist computer. The salvaged civilian tech just compatible enough with military encryption to read basic files. Text scrolled across his screen. Project Catalyst, his name, Kyra's designation, everything. The file opened with clinical efficiency, laying out the operation in bullet points and probability matrices, reducing human lives and political consequences to acceptable risk calculations. Garrett read in silence as his hands started to shake. Earth Strategic Command had known about the Calathar, had known about the buried nodes scattered across disputed space, had known about the political fracture inside the Covenant, the hardliners versus moderates, the delicate balance that could tip into civil war with the right pressure. They'd identified Kira as Kormara, warbound commander, only heir to the Starborn Covenant's leadership structure, her death or her bonding to a human. Either outcome served Earth's interests. If she died, the hardliners would have their martyr, would push for human eradication, would trigger a war Earth had been preparing for, where conflict meant access to Calathar technology through salvage rights in conquered territory. If she survived and bonded to a human, it would destabilize covenant politics, create fractures, opportunities, ways to drive wedges into alien society and expand Earth's influence through cultural contamination rather than open warfare. Garrett had been chosen specifically. Whistleblower history meant he was already considered politically unreliable, expendable if things went wrong. His financial desperation after losing his NASA position meant he'd take contracts others wouldn't. His technical skills meant he might actually succeed at keeping Kira alive through the initial contact. Perfect bait, perfect catalyst, perfect acceptable loss if the plan collapsed. The convoy had been set up from the beginning. The raiders paid to attack at specific coordinates, specific timing. The hunters briefed on Kira's location. Everything choreographed to create the exact scenario that would force a human to make a choice. Save the alien or stay safe. Earth had gambled that Garrett's documented pattern of choosing moral action over self-preservation would override survival instinct. They'd gambled correctly, and they'd done it while marking him for termination the moment he served his purpose. I was bait, Garrett said aloud, voice hollow. They knew exactly who I was, what I'd do. They weaponized my own conscience against me. Kira moved beside him, reading over his shoulder, her translator parsing the military documentation, her expression hardening into something cold and ancient as the full scope became clear. And my people knew, she said softly. The Council. They had intelligence about Earth's plans. They voted 4-3 to let it proceed. Garrett looked at her sharply. What? They believed my death would unify the Covenant, end the political debates through martyrdom, sacrifice one warrior to prevent civil war. Her voice carried bitterness that cut like shattered glass. I was declared acceptable loss by my own leaders. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Both governments had known, both had planned, both had been willing to let their own people die to achieve political objectives hidden beneath layers of strategic justification. They used us, Garrett said. Both sides, we weren't people to them. We were chess pieces. Kira's jaw clenched. And you broke both their games by refusing to follow the script. The first warning shot rang out, kicking up dust 5 feet to Garrett's left. Kira stepped forward, beside Garrett, equal partners facing threat together. You saved my life, she said, voice carrying certainty that cut through everything. Now I will save yours. She drove her broken blade shard into the rocky ground. The world answered. Light erupted, not explosion, not violence, release, like she'd punctured something that had been building pressure for centuries. Waiting for someone who remembered the old languages, the old oaths, the old ways of commanding reality through will and blood right. Veins of pale violet energy spread outward in a perfect circle, carving symbols into stone and soil. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly because they existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. The symbols weren't written. They were remembered. By the moon, by the ancient machinery sleeping kilometers below, by technology so old that human civilization was barely a footnote in its operational timeline. Every electronic system in the soldier's armor screamed and died. Targeting arrays went dark. Communications dissolved into static. Heads-up displays flickered once and surrendered, leaving 8 highly trained operatives suddenly blind inside their helmets, reduced to looking through manual viewports like their ancestors had done before technology promised to make warfare clean. The nearest soldier's armor locked. Joints froze mid-step. Servos fighting against forces that rewrote local gravity to suit convenience rather than physics. He collapsed to his knees, unable to move, eyes wide with terror behind his visor. The others staggered, suddenly carrying weight that hadn't existed a moment before. Their armor transformed from tactical advantage to crushing liability. Garrett stumbled back, heart hammering. What? What did you just... Kira straightened fully, blood still leaking from a partially healed wounds, but posture transforming from injured survivor to something ancient and terrible. The bioluminescent patterns across her skin blazed bright enough to cast shadows, networked to the energy flowing through the ground, turning her into a living conduit, but her legs trembled, hidden beneath her stance. But Garrett saw it. She was burning through reserves she didn't have, buying seconds at the cost of hours of recovery. Blood seeped fresh from wounds that had started to close. 30 seconds, she whispered to Garrett, voice tight with strain. Then I collapse. Make them count. I called my oath, she said aloud, voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the symbols spreading across the moon's surface. This place remembers Calathar sovereignty, remembers when my ancestors walked here, built here, died here, defending what they loved. She raised one hand. The gesture looked casual. The effect was not. Another soldier dropped. Armor locking as ancient systems recognized authority written into the fabric of reality by civilizations that had mastered stellar engineering while humanity was still figuring out fire. Caldwell fought to raise her weapon, muscles straining against pressure pushing down on her shoulders. What is this? This moon lies above a buried node, Kira explained, voice calm despite the tremor in her frame. Ancient technology forgotten by most. But my people remember. We always remember our sacred places. Another gesture. Another soldier collapsed. Your kind builds machines, Kira continued, stepping forward with slow inevitability. Mine remembers places, knows how to ask them for old favors, old debts. Garrett stared, not at the soldiers, at Kira. This was power far beyond battlefield prowess, not brute force, control, precision, authority written into existence itself. This was what Earth feared. What they'd been willing to sacrifice him to understand and control. What the Calathar represented. Power that didn't care about human ambition. The node's glow began to fade. Kira swayed, the 30 seconds running out. Garrett moved, catching her before she fell, taking her weight as the energy released and the symbols carved into stone went dark. The soldiers remained paralyzed by locked armor, but they'd recover. Eventually, enough time to run, but not enough to feel safe. You need to teach me that trick, Garrett said, supporting her weight. Kira's laugh was weak. That trick may have just cost me a week of recovery, but it bought us minutes. Use them well. Garrett looked at the immobilized soldiers, at Caldwell struggling against her own equipment. Then he started stripping their gear. Data chips, communication modules, anything that could track or coordinate. When he was done, he had an idea. Terrible idea, probably gets them both killed. But it was the most human solution he could think of. I have a plan, he said, slowly. Terrible plan, but it's better than letting them win. Kira studied his expression, seeing the calculation happening behind his eyes, the moral mathematics of someone deciding which rules to break. Human ideas are usually terrible, she observed, but they work more often than they should. What do you propose? Garrett pulled up his wrist computer's communication interface, started configuring broadcast parameters that would turn his civilian equipment into an improvised transmission array. We expose everything, publicly, make it impossible for either side to cover up. They will hunt us for this. They're already hunting us. Garrett started uploading files, encrypting them for burst transmission across every frequency he could access. But if this goes public, we stop being convenient victims. We become witnesses, evidence, the thing they have to discredit instead of quietly eliminate. Kira's tactical mind ran probability scenarios. Then something like approval crossed her alien features. You fight by changing the battlefield, by making the hidden visible. It's what I'm good at, Garrett admitted. Got me fired from NASA. Got me blacklisted from half the contractors in the solar system. Might as well use it for something that matters. He finished the upload configuration, fingers flying across the interface with the speed of someone who'd done similar work before, who understood exactly how to bypass security protocols and route signals through relay networks that couldn't be easily traced or shut down. When I trigger this, every news network, every civilian channel, every military band that isn't actively encrypted will get the files. Earth media monitoring stations. Everyone. They will consider this an act of war. They already committed acts of war. Garrett looked at her directly. This is your fight too. Your people wanted you dead. You get a say in whether we do this. Kira reached out and placed her hand over his on the interface. The gesture of partnership, of shared consequence. Expose them, she said. Both sides. Let truth be the weapon they never planned for. Garrett triggered the broadcast. Data exploded outward across every available frequency, compressed files expanding as they hit relay stations, civilian networks. even hijacking emergency broadcast systems designed for natural disasters and turning them into channels for deliberate revelation. Project Catalyst, the conspiracy, the names, dates, financial trails, communication logs, everything. Within seconds, Garrett's risk computer started showing response pings, news organizations picking up the signal, military channels going active with confused chatter, civilian forums lighting up with shock and speculation. The secret was out, spreading, replicating across networks faster than any containment could suppress. Caldwell's voice cut through on the military band. No longer professional, pure fury now. "Ashford, you just signed your death warrant," Garrett responded calmly, broadcasting on the same frequency so anyone monitoring would hear. "No, Captain. I just made it too expensive to kill me quietly. Now everyone's watching. Now it matters." He cut the connection. Kira's tactical sensors pinged urgent warning. "The Calathar fleet, they're moving. Coming here." Garrett looked up. The sky, pale and empty moments before, now showed dark shapes descending through the thin atmosphere. Dozens of shim, elegant and terrifying, their hulls drinking light as they approached. The response was faster than he'd expected, faster than should have been possible unless they'd been waiting, watching, prepared to intervene the moment circumstances demanded it. Kira closed her eyes briefly, some internal sense activating, reading signals Garrett couldn't perceive. "They felt the node activation," she said, "the energy signature broadcast through the network. Every Calathar vessel with proper sensors knows a warbound called ancient power, and they'll want to know why." The ship settled onto the moon's surface with the coordinated precision of military formation. Not aggressive deployment, controlled arrival, the difference between attack and judgment. A ramp extended from the nearest vessel, massive and ornate, decorated with the same constellation patterns that mark Kyra's armor. Figures emerged, tall, armored in layered plates that shifted color as they moved, each one radiating the controlled danger of professional warriors. At their center walked an older Calathar female. Her armor was simpler than the others, darker, marked with symbols worn smooth by time and repeated use. Her eyes glowed, not bright violet like Kira's, but a deep indigo, calm, heavy, ancient in a way that transcended simple age. Kira immediately dropped to one knee, the gesture automatic, drilled by culture and training too deep to question even in current circumstances. "High Arbiter Thane," she said formally. "I return wounded, but unbroken." Garrett's instincts screamed at him to kneel as well, to show deference to obvious authority, to make himself small and unthreatening. He didn't. He remained standing, not defiant, just present. Witness rather than supplicant. Thane's gaze slid to him immediately, assessing with the kind of attention that felt like being dissected by someone who understood anatomy well enough to kill or heal with equal precision. "A human," she said, her voice carrying without effort, each word precisely shaped. The kind of speaker who never needed to raise volume because command existed in cadence and certainty rather than force. Unarmed, standing while others kneel. Interesting. Garrett cleared his throat. "Oh, ma'am." A ripple moved through the gathered Calathar warriors. Not laughter. Something else. Acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition that this human at least understood basic respect even if he chose not to perform expected submission. Kira looked at Garrett, surprise flickering across her features, then something that might have been approval. Thane stepped closer, movement graceful despite the armor's weight, stopping just beyond striking distance. "You smell of metal, and fear," she observed. "Yet you stand. We see you." Garrett considered several diplomatic answers, things that might smooth this interaction toward peaceful resolution. Then decided honesty had worked so far. Might as well continue the pattern. "Because kneeling felt wrong. Because I don't know your customs well enough to fake respect. And real respect shouldn't require performance." "Many creatures do foolish things when frightened," Thane replied. "That does not make them worthy of notice." "I'm not looking for notice," Garrett said. "I'm looking to keep my friend alive. Everything else is negotiable." Thane's expression shifted fractionally. Then she turned her full attention to Kyra. "You invoked Tel-Kareth. You claimed bond with this human. Explain." Kira straightened but remained kneeling. the posture of someone showing respect while preparing to defend what mattered. He saved my life when retreat was logical. When survival advised abandoning me to honorable death, he chose intervention. Fought without seeking dominance. Protected without demanding reward. Many species show mercy when it costs nothing, Thane countered. It cost him everything, Kira said flatly. His people marked him for death, used him as bait. He knew. And still he stood with me when his own military came to finish what the hunter started. Thane's eyes narrowed. You claim he chose you over his species? I claim he followed principle despite personal cost, Kira replied, voice carrying absolute conviction. I claim Telkareth because he earned it, because he is worthy. Silence fell across the landing site, heavy with implication. Thane studied Garrett again, longer this time, reading things he couldn't begin to guess. Did you know what she was? The Arbiter asked him directly. When you intervened, did you know her rank, her importance, her political value? No, ma'am, Garrett answered honestly. Just knew she was dying. And if you had known, Garrett met the ancient indigo gaze without flinching. Still wouldn't have left her. Before Thane could respond, new ships tore into orbit above them. Angular and aggressive, weapons hot. Human warships, military cruisers that made no attempt at diplomatic approach. No hesitation, no peaceful overture. A voice boomed across open channels, amplified to ensure everyone heard. Human and alien alike. This is Terran's strategic command. The alien entity, designated Kyra Velsharn, is to be surrendered immediately. Non-compliance will be met with appropriate force. Thane's expression hardened into something cold and absolutely lethal. So, she said softly, the quiet more terrifying than any shout. This is your people's answer. This is how humanity negotiates. Garrett stepped forward before anyone could stop him, before the moment crystallized into inevitability. No, he said loudly, that's how some humans negotiate. The ones who sent me to die. The ones who wanted this exact scenario. He pulled up his wrist computer, showed the broadcast data still streaming across networks. I exposed them. Their conspiracy. Their manipulation of both our species. Everyone knows now, Earth media, your monitoring stations, everyone. Thane raised one hand. The Calathar warriors lowered their weapons fractionally, waiting for her judgment. She looked between Garrett and Kyra, then at the human ships in orbit, at the evidence still broadcasting across 1,000 channels. Both governments planned this scenario, she said, addressing not just them, but the billions watching across light years of distance. Earth Strategic Command and elements of our own council. They used our laws, our customs, our people as pieces in games played for power rather than survival. She gestured. Holographic displays materialized, showing the files Garrett had broadcast. Project Catalyst in all its detailed manipulation. The vote records from the Calathar Council, financial trails, communication logs, everything. Garrett Ashford acted when we, with all our accumulated wisdom, chose politics over principle. Thane continued. He shames us. He shames his own leaders. He forces us to confront what we became while pretending to be honorable. Another Calathar Arbiter stepped forward. Male, his armor covered with military honors. Arbiter Dravik, from the markings. You defend this human? This? I defend truth, Thane interrupted, her voice carrying absolute authority, something we claim to value while avoiding it when convenient. She turned to Kira. You claim Telkareth. Explain why we should accept a bond that fractures tradition. Kira drew herself up, and Garrett saw the warrior leader she'd been before injury and conspiracy had reduced her to survival mode. I claimed him because he remembered what we forgot, she said, voice ringing clear. That strength without compassion is just violence. That honor measured only in victory is hollow. That choosing right action matters more than choosing convenient action. She looked directly at Dravik. You call him inferior. But when I was dying, when both our peoples had written me off as acceptable loss, he intervened. Not for reward, not for status, because it was right. Kira's gaze swept the assembled warriors, the watching billions. If that makes him inferior, then we have measured worth incorrectly for centuries. Thane allowed silence to stretch. Then she spoke words that would reshape everything that followed. The council will deliberate. We will decide if this bond stands. If these two who shame both our governments deserve the partnership they claim. She looked at Garrett and Kira. Or if tradition matters more than truth. The Calathar warriors formed a circle, their armor beginning to glow with internal light. A private conference that excluded everyone else. Garrett and Kira stood in the center, watched by billions, waiting for judgment that would reshape their lives and potentially the relationship between their species. Above them, human warships held position, waiting to see if their ultimatum would be answered with compliance or war. And across 1,000 worlds, people watched, human and Calathar alike, seeing two individuals who'd chosen each other over species loyalty, who'd chosen truth over convenient lies, who'd proven that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was refuse to play the game. Time stretched. The council deliberating in their circle of light while the universe held its breath. Finally, the platforms brightened. The arbiters had decided. Thane spoke into the waiting silence. We have reviewed evidence. We have weighed testimony. We have considered precedent and consequence. She paused, the silence carrying enormous weight. The vote is 4-3. The Telkareth bond is accepted. Garrett's knees nearly buckled with relief. Beside him, Kira remained rigidly upright. But he felt her hand brush against his, brief contact that carried profound emotion. However, Thane continued, and Garrett's relief evaporated. Acceptance comes with conditions and consequences. She addressed them both. You have created unprecedented situation. You are now symbols, evidence that species cooperation is possible, that individual choice can matter more than institutional directive. Thane's expression hardened. You will become what you accidentally created, bridge between species. Evidence that cooperation is possible. She paused, letting the weight sink in. You must return to Earth as official Calathar representatives. You will face those who tried to kill you. You will negotiate for the species that marked you expendable. You will stand in halls of power and argue for cooperation with those who conspired against you. The cruelty of it hit like physical blow. Not exile, not escape, return. Facing them with authority they couldn't ignore but desperately wanted to eliminate. Do you accept these terms? Thane asked formally. Kira looked at Garrett, the question clear in her eyes. Your choice. Our choice. Garrett thought about the convoy burning, about pulling Kyra from certain death, about exposing conspiracies that would have consumed them both, about every choice that had led to this moment. We accept, he said, and felt Kira's approval like warmth. We accept, she echoed. Thane allowed herself a small smile. Then let it be witnessed. The bond stands. The partnership begins. She paused. May you prove worthy of the chaos you have created. Above them, the human warships began to withdraw, slowly, reluctantly, but moving away from immediate confrontation. The impossible had happened. Two people from different worlds had chosen each other, and both their governments had been forced to accept it. The Calathar warriors began preparing transport vessels. Thane moved off to coordinate with her council. The human ships maintained their distance in orbit, wary, watching. For a moment, Garrett and Kira stood alone in the aftermath. She looked at him, really looked. Not as warbound to rescued, not as symbol to symbol, but as person to person who just made impossible choice together. You could have denied the bond, she said quietly. When Thane asked, you could have said I claimed you without consent. Walked away free. Garrett met her violet eyes. Could have. Didn't want to. Why? He thought about all the times he'd walked away. From NASA, from military service, from every situation where staying meant being complicit. How tired he'd gotten of leaving. Because I'm tired of the easy choice, he said finally. Because you're worth the hard one. Because, he paused. Because when I look at you, I don't see alien or asset or political complication. I see someone who stood up when her own people declared her expendable. Someone who chose truth over convenience. He smiled faintly. Turns out we're more alike than either species wants to admit. Kira's hand found his. Squeezed once. The gesture carrying everything words couldn't. Telkareth Sinkorala, she said softly. The phrase formal, sacred. Until stars fade. Until stars fade, Garrett repeated, meaning it more with each word. They stood together. Two people from different worlds who'd chosen each other over every logical reason not to. The universe was watching, billions across both species, seeing partnership that shouldn't exist, that both governments had tried to prevent or manipulate. And in that moment, under alien stars, Garrett and Kira stopped being individuals. They became proof that bridges could be built. That choice mattered. That sometimes the most dangerous thing two people could do was refuse to hate each other. The consequences were coming. Enormous. Unavoidable. But they'd face them together. Thane's voice called them to the transport. Time to begin the next impossible task. Garrett and Kira walked toward their future. Side by side, partners in truth. The game had changed. The players had refused their roles, and across 1,000 worlds, people watched and wondered. If two could choose each other across every barrier, maybe more could follow. Maybe the bridge between stars began with exactly this. Two people, one choice, infinite consequences. The neutral station designated Bridge's End hung in the darkness between territories. Neither Earth nor Calathar claiming sovereignty, both watching with suspicion and hope in equal measure. The structure itself was new, built in the 2 weeks since the judgment. Modular construction that spoke of compromise and careful negotiation. Human engineering married to Calathar aesthetics in a way that satisfied neither species completely, but offended both equally little. Garrett stood in what passed for the training room, breathing hard, body aching from another session learning Calathar combat techniques. He was terrible at it. Reflexes too slow, instincts wrong for their style of flowing precision. But he was improving, slowly, painfully, but measurably. Kyra circled him with the patience of someone who taught hundreds of students and knew the difference between inability and learning curve. Your form is still awful, she observed. Blade arm extended in demonstration position. Garrett wiped sweat from his face, grinning despite exhaustion. Your teaching method is sadistic. It keeps you alive. That is the only metric that matters. She moved again, the training sequence designed to build muscle memory through repetition. Connor followed, stumbling but determined. They'd fallen into rhythm over the past 2 weeks. Kira led diplomatic negotiations, her presence commanding immediate respect from Calathar representatives, enforcing human delegates to reconsider assumptions. Garrett handled technical problems, cultural translation, the 1,000 small details that made cooperation possible, and they'd survived their first real successes together. A minor trade dispute between a human mining operation and a Calathar cultural preservation site, the kind of thing that could have escalated into armed confrontation if both sides dug in. Garrett had found the technical solution, rerouting the mining operation to equally rich deposits that didn't violate sacred ground. Kira had convinced her people that human ignorance wasn't always malice, a border incident where a human patrol ship had strayed into restricted space. Kyra's intervention had prevented the Calathar from treating it as invasion. Garrett's testimony that the patrol captain had been following outdated charts rather than testing boundaries had been believed. Barely, small victories, fragile, but building credibility slowly, carefully. News coverage remained intense. Some celebrated them as breakthrough. Others called for arrest or censure. Human extremist groups branded Garrett a traitor. Calathar traditionalists demanded Kyra be stripped of rank and exiled. But they were still here, still working, still proving partnership was possible. Late one night, both exhausted from a particularly difficult mediation session, they sat in Garrett's quarters, the human side of the station. Kira had her own space in the Calathar section, but she'd taken to spending time here. The human furniture was wrong for her physiology, the lighting too harsh, but she stayed anyway. Do you regret it? Garrett asked quietly. Being bound to me, all the complications, the death threats, knowing we'll face worse when we return to Earth. Kira was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the viewport where both Earth's sun and the Calathar home system were visible as distant points of light. I regret that my species tried to kill me, she said finally, that yours voted you expendable. She looked at him directly. I don't regret claiming the bond. Don't regret any choice that led here. Her hand found his, the gesture natural now after 2 weeks of partnership. Do you regret accepting? Garrett thought about his old life, the quiet anonymity of rescue work, the simple clarity of pulling people from wrecks. How uncomplicated everything had been, when the universe was smaller and his choices affected only himself. No, he said, and meant it. I don't regret standing with you. Don't regret exposing them. Don't regret any of it. He smiled faintly. Even knowing we face assassination attempts, political pressure, extremists from both sides. Especially because of that, someone has to prove cooperation is possible. Might as well be us. Kira studied his face, searching for doubt, for regret, for the cracks that would signal their partnership was built on desperation rather than genuine commitment. She found none. Tell Kareths and Korala, she said softly, voice carrying the weight of sacred oath. Until stars fade. Until stars fade, Garrett replied. 6 days into their second week, it happened. A delegation arrived from the Terran Colonial Alliance. Legitimate representatives. Properly credentialed. Bringing what they claimed was a gesture of goodwill. Gifts to commemorate the new partnership. Art pieces. Cultural artifacts. A basket of earth foods for Garrett and crystallized minerals from various human-controlled worlds for Kyra. The security scans had cleared everything. Standard protocols. Nothing suspicious. Kira had been in the main conference room when the gift basket arrived. Garrett was in his quarters reviewing reports for the next day's mediation session. He'd planned to join her in 20 minutes. Something made Kira pause as the human aide set the basket on the table. Not threat assessment from her armor's sensors. Something older, more fundamental. The kind of instinct that kept warriors alive when technology failed. The way the aide moved. Too careful. Too precise. Like someone handling something fragile rather than decorative. The micro-expression when their eyes met. Fear masquerading as professionalism. Kira's combat training took over. Pure reflex faster than conscious thought. She moved. The plasma charge hidden in the false bottom of the basket detonated as she crossed the space between table and Garrett's position at the doorway. The explosion was shaped, directed, designed to kill everything in a cone extending from the basket. Kyra hit Garrett with her full weight, driving him back through the doorway, her body between him and the blast. The world turned white in thunder. Garrett felt the impact, felt Kyra's weight, felt the heat wash over them, then felt her go limp in his arms. The emergency systems kicked in. Fire suppression, medical alerts, security lockdown. Garrett scrambled to his knees. Kira lay motionless. The back of her armor was scorched, melted in places. Blue blood leaked from joints where the ceramic had failed. No, Garrett heard himself say. No, 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 not again. You don't get to do this again. Her eyes flickered. Violet glow dim but present. Tell Kareth, she whispered, voice barely audible. Mine to protect. You're supposed to let me take hits too, Garrett said, his hands already moving. Assessing damage, triaging injuries. Partnership means we share the risk, remember? Forgot, Kira managed. Might have been trying to smile. Hard to tell with pain and approaching shock. We'll remember, next time. Medical teams arrived within minutes. Calathar physicians who'd been stationed on Bridges End as part of the joint operation. They worked with desperate efficiency, but even through the professional calm, Garrett saw concern. The blast had damaged Kira's crystalline patterns. The bioluminescent network that regulated her species-enhanced physiology. Without proper treatment, the patterns would degrade, organs would fail. She'd die slowly over days rather than minutes. But there was a problem. The Calathar medical database on Bridges End was incomplete. Safety restriction from the Covenant. They wouldn't provide full medical knowledge to humans yet. Didn't trust Earth with information that could be weaponized. The lead physician, an older male named Varric, looked at Garrett with resignation. We can stabilize her, keep her alive for transport back to Calathar medical facilities. But the journey is 8 days. She has perhaps 3 before pattern degradation becomes irreversible. Garrett's mind raced. What do you need? What treatment would save her? Electromagnetic pulse therapy, very specific frequencies, must be calibrated to individual pattern resonance, applied continuously for 72 hours. Varric pulled up holographic displays showing Kira's damaged patterns, the slow spread of system failure. We don't have the equipment here. Earth technology cannot. Show me the frequencies, Garrett interrupted. Varric blinked. What? Show me the exact frequencies, the calibration protocols. Everything. You're human, you cannot possibly. I spent 3 years at NASA developing electromagnetic medical devices, Garrett said flatly. Lost my job for refusing to cut safety corners. But I know the physics. I know the engineering. Show me what she needs and I'll build it. Varric studied him, seeing desperation. But also competence. The kind of focused intensity that came from someone who'd solved impossible problems before. If you fail, she dies, the physician said quietly. If I don't try, she dies, Garrett replied. Those aren't acceptable options. Show me. The next 72 hours existed in a haze of desperate improvisation and borrowed time. Varric gave him everything, the frequencies, the calibration requirements, the tolerances within which the treatment had to operate or risk making things worse. Garrett took over Bridges End's main engineering bay, stripped electromagnetic components from every system he could access without crippling life support. Human parts, Calathar technology, civilian equipment, and military-grade sensors all jury-rigged into a framework that shouldn't work but had to. He worked without stopping, hands moving through familiar patterns, mind calculating solutions to problems he'd never encountered but understood the principles of. Sleep deprivation made everything harder, made his fingers less steady, made calculations take longer. He ignored it, pushed through on stimulants and stubbornness and the absolute certainty that failure wasn't survivable. Kira lay in the medical bay, unconscious. The physicians keeping her stable through conventional means while Garrett built his impossible machine. Hour 36, the first prototype failed. Wrong frequency modulation would have done more harm than good. Hour 48, the second iteration showed promise but couldn't maintain calibration. Drifted outside safe parameters within minutes. Hour 60, breakthrough. A hybrid approach using human precision timing and Calathar resonance crystals to maintain frequency lock. It worked in testing, stayed calibrated, delivered exactly what Kyra needed. Hour 64, they moved Kyra to the engineering bay, set her within the field generator Garrett had built, activated the system. The electromagnetic pulses were invisible, but their effect wasn't. Kira's damaged patterns began to glow. Faintly at first, then stronger. The energy feeding into her biology, stimulating regeneration, encouraging her body to remember what it should be. Garrett monitored readouts, made micro-adjustments, watched as slowly, impossibly, the degradation stopped. Reversed, her patterns strengthening, wounds closing. Hour 72, Varric checked her vitals and looked at Garrett with something approaching awe. She'll live, the physician said quietly. Full recovery, no permanent damage. He paused. You built functional medical equipment from salvage in 3 days, using principles you couldn't possibly understand. I understood the physics, Garrett said, too exhausted for modesty. The biology was guesswork, but educated guesswork. You saved her life. She saved mine first. Garrett looked at Kira, still unconscious but stable, alive. Third time we've done this dance. Starting to think we should stop taking turns almost dying. Varric almost smiled. That would be wise. When Kyra woke, it was with Garrett asleep in a chair beside her bed, his hand resting near hers. Not touching. Just close. Like he'd been monitoring her vitals until exhaustion claimed him. She studied his face, the dark circles under his eyes. The exhaustion written in every line. The stubble of 3 days without shaving. She'd taken the blast meant for him. Barely survived, and he'd spent 3 days building miracle machines to pull her back from death. Telkareth didn't balance, she told him once. It accumulated. Now she understood what that meant. Not keeping score, not trading saves like currency, but building something that transcended individual actions, where protecting each other became instinct, where the question wasn't whose turn, but simply what needs doing. Partnership. Her movement woke him. Garrett's eyes opened, took a moment to focus, then saw her conscious and relief flooded his features. Hey, he said, voice rough with sleep deprivation. Welcome back. You built me a medical device, Kira said, statement rather than question. Had help. Varric provided the specs. I just made it work with human parts. In 3 days. 72 hours, Garrett corrected. Couldn't let you have all the dramatic saves. Kira's hand found his, gripped with strength that surprised them both. Thank you. You took a blast meant for me. I built a machine. We're even. We're not keeping score, Kira said, echoing her own words from weeks ago. It accumulates. Yeah, Garrett agreed. It does. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Kira spoke again. The aide who brought the basket, human extremists? Being questioned now. Terran security is cooperating. Turns out they didn't want Bridges End to fail spectacularly on their watch either. Makes them look bad. Will there be more attempts? Probably, Garrett said honestly. We knew this was coming. Being bridge walkers makes us targets for anyone who wants war instead of peace. Then we adapt, Kira said. Become harder targets. Keep building what they're trying to destroy. You just nearly died. Not my first time, won't be my last. She met his eyes. But each time I survive, we prove partnership works, that we protect each other, that bridges hold under pressure. Garrett laughed softly. You're starting to think like a human, stubborn optimism in the face of terrible odds. You're starting to think like Calathar, honor through action rather than words. She paused. Perhaps that's the point. We become proof that the boundaries aren't as fixed as either side wants to believe. 3 days later, news arrived that sent ripples through both Earth and Calathar networks. Captain Brenna Caldwell had been arrested, charged with conspiracy, attempted murder, and violations of the Terran military code. She was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges, providing testimony about Project Catalyst, naming names, exposing the conspiracy's depth. Some accountability existed. Garrett felt complicated emotions. Relief that justice was happening. Sadness that it required explosion and exposure rather than internal integrity. Anger that it had taken this much for people to care. She was following orders, he said quietly when Kira showed him the news. As were the guards at every historical atrocity, Kira replied, voice carrying the weight of someone whose culture had learned these lessons the hard way. Orders do not absolve choice. She is learning that cost. 1 week after the assassination attempt, while Kyra was still recovering, a distress call came through. Civilian transport under attack. Raiders, neither human nor Calathar. Just opportunists exploiting the tension between species to hit soft targets while authorities were distracted. Bridges End was the closest station, but they had no military assets, no defense forces. They were diplomats, mediators, symbols. Garrett looked at the tactical display, saw the transport's trajectory, calculated response times. Earth and Calathar military both were too far. The transport would be gutted before help arrived, unless someone else responded. He called Kyra. She was supposed to be resting. Doctor's orders. Another 3 days before full duty. She answered immediately. I see the distress call. You're not cleared for combat. Neither are you. We're diplomats. We're also the only ones who can help. Garrett pulled up shuttle manifests. Bridges End has 2 armed patrol craft, human and Calathar surplus, donated for station security. You can fly human vessels? Used to pilot rescue shuttles. Close enough. And I am Calathar warbound. I can operate our craft. Kira paused. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? First Joint Human Calathar Defense Operation. We coordinate. Use both craft. Save those people. Silence on the channel. Then Kira's voice came back, fierce and certain. I'll meet you in the hangar. They launched within minutes. Garrett in the human patrol craft, weapon systems he barely understood but could figure out. Kira in the Calathar vessel, sleek and deadly, an extension of her combat training. The raiders saw 2 ships approaching. Expected easy targets. Diplomats playing soldier. They were wrong. Garrett's technical expertise gave him angles the raiders didn't expect. He used the transport itself as shield, drew fire away from civilians. His weapons weren't military grade, but they were sufficient. Precise shots that disabled rather than destroyed when possible. Kira's tactical genius turned the battle into demonstration of superior strategy. She moved like she fought on the ground, flowing precision, using the raiders' aggression against them, leading them into crossfire, creating situations where they had to choose between protecting themselves or pressing the attack. She chose protecting the transport over glory. The coordination between them was imperfect. They'd never trained together in space combat, didn't have formal communication protocols. Made it up as they went, but it worked because they understood each other, trusted each other, knew without discussion that protecting civilians mattered more than personal safety. 15 minutes after engagement began, the raiders withdrew, damaged, defeated, convinced that these particular diplomats were more trouble than any cargo was worth. The civilian transport was intact, shaken but alive, broadcasting thanks across every frequency. Garrett and Kira returned to Bridge's End. News coverage exploded within hours. Footage from both ships' cameras. Analysis from military experts who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Civilians saved by the same partnership their governments had tried to prevent. For the first time since the judgment, momentum shifted. Support for Bridge's End increased. Donations, volunteers. Other species asking if they could send representatives. Suddenly, cooperation didn't seem impossible. It seemed necessary, proven. The training room had become their ritual, every day, building understanding through physical practice. Kira teaching Garrett to fight like Calathar. Garrett teaching Kira human improvisation. 2 weeks after the Raider engagement, they moved through forms together, synchronized now in ways they hadn't been when they started. Still not perfect, but functional, effective. Your form is still awful, Kira observed, but her tone had shifted, less critique, more fond exasperation. Garrett grinned. Your standards? Impossible. They keep you alive. They make me tired. They finished the sequence. Stood facing each other, breathing hard but satisfied. 2 weeks of recovery, of building credibility, of proving partnership worked in crisis. Tomorrow they'd begin preparing for the hardest part, return to Earth. As official Calathar representatives, facing those who tried to kill them. But tonight they had this. Training room quiet except for their breathing. Viewport showing stars from both their territories. What we're building, Garrett said quietly. Will it last? Kira studied him, seeing the doubt creeping in, the weight of what lay ahead. As long as we choose to maintain it, beyond that is not our responsibility. What if we fail? What if we return to Earth and it all collapses? What if this partnership proves we were just lucky? Then we fail, Kira said simply. But we fail having tried, having chosen each other, having proven it was possible, even if just for this moment. She stepped closer, hand finding his. I don't regret claiming you. Don't regret standing with you. Don't regret any choice that led here. Garrett squeezed her hand. I don't regret accepting. Don't regret exposing them. Don't regret any of it. Kira leaned her head on his shoulder. The gesture of trust earned over 3 weeks of partnership, of watching each other's backs, of choosing transparencies over convenient deception. Tel Karath Sinkarala, she said softly, the ritual phrase carrying new weight. Until stars fade, Garrett replied, meaning it more with each repetition. They stood together, watching the space between their peoples. The distance they were slowly bridging through stubbornness and choice and refusal to accept that species division was inevitable. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of story that ended in explosive triumph or tragic sacrifice. It was just two people from different worlds choosing each other over and over again, choosing honesty when lies would be easier, choosing partnership when isolation would be safer, choosing to believe that change started with individual actions, not grand proclamations. Behind them, the station hummed with activity. Diplomatic meetings scheduled for tomorrow. Trade negotiations next week. Cultural exchanges being planned. All the mundane work of building peace one careful agreement at a time. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but possible. And in a universe that had grown comfortable with division and suspicion, possibility mattered more than certainty ever could. Garrett thought about the convoy burning, about foam seals and desperate improvisation, about pulling a dying warrior from certain death without knowing her name or importance. He'd saved her because it was right. She'd claimed him because he'd proven worthy. Now they'd built something together that neither could have created alone. Not peace, not yet. Maybe never, but the foundation for it. The proof that it could exist. The demonstration that when individuals chose principle over convenience, when they valued each other's lives over species loyalty, when they refused to let their governments define the limits of cooperation, things changed, slowly, painfully. with setbacks and resistance and genuine danger. But they changed. Kira straightened, pulling back to look at him directly. Her hand came up to rest against his cheek. The gesture she'd used in the pod when claiming him now transformed from desperate declaration into gentle affection. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not leaving me to die honorably." Her lips curved slightly. "For being foolish enough to intervene. For staying foolish enough to keep choosing me despite every logical reason to walk away." Garrett laughed softly. "Thank you for being worth the foolishness. For claiming someone who had no idea what he was getting into. For trusting me with your life when your entire culture said humans weren't trustworthy." "You proved them wrong," Kira said. "Daily, you continue proving them wrong." "We prove them wrong," Garrett corrected. "Together. That's the whole point, isn't it? That neither of us has to be perfect alone because we're building something together." Kira's expression shifted to something fierce and proud. "Yes, that is exactly the point. That is what terrifies them. Not that individuals might be noble, that individuals might choose each other across every boundary they built to keep us separate." She pressed her hand to his chest over his heart, the formal gesture of her people that had become their private ritual. "You chose right action. I chose you. Together we choose what comes next. Every day, every challenge, every attempt to force us back into the boxes they built." Garrett covered her hand with his own, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. The proof that they'd both survived when survival had seemed impossible. Together, whatever that looks like, whatever it costs, however long it takes. Outside the viewport, the stars turned in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas playing out on space stations and negotiation tables. But the people who watched those stars, human and Calathar alike, were changing, slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. Because two individuals had chosen each other over species loyalty, had chosen truth over convenient lies, had chosen partnership when isolation would have been safer. And that choice, repeated daily, witnessed by billions, was beginning to reshape how the universe looked at the space between different kinds of consciousness, was beginning to prove that bonds could cross any distance if both parties chose to maintain them, was beginning to build something that might last beyond the individuals who started it, or it might fail spectacularly. But either way, Garrett Ashford and Kyra Velsharn would face the outcome together, choosing each other, choosing honor, choosing the hard work of building peace through example rather than demanding it through force, until stars fade, until the choice no longer needed making, until partnership became so natural that no one remembered when it had seemed impossible. They returned to training, to preparation, to the practical work of ensuring they'd survive whatever came next. Because words and ideals only mattered if you lived long enough to make them real. Kira moved through the combat forms, Garrett following with improving coordination, their movements synchronized gradually. The physical echo of partnership built on mutual trust and shared purpose. This was the work, not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but daily practice, daily choice, daily commitment to being worthy of what they'd claimed. The story wasn't ending, it was evolving, growing, becoming something larger than either had imagined when Garrett pulled a dying warrior from hunters, and she claimed him as Telkareth in a failing escape pod. In 6 months, they'd return to Earth as official representatives, face human government, navigate political pressure that would make assassination attempts seem straightforward. But they'd proven they could handle impossible, could turn limitation into advantage, could build bridges where both sides insisted only walls could exist. They'd proved in partnership worked. That protection went both ways. That choosing each other daily created something stronger than any bond forced by circumstance. The universe was watching, billions across both species, some hoping they'd succeed, others waiting for failure to justify prejudice. But Garrett and Kira had stopped caring about the audience. They cared about the work, the daily choice, the incremental progress towards something neither species thought possible. They cared about each other, not as symbols or representatives or political statements, but as partners who'd seen each other at most vulnerable and chose to stay, who'd saved each other's lives and built trust through action rather than words, who understood that the bridge between stars began with two people willing to meet in the middle. The training session ended. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching stars that belonged to both their peoples and neither. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to prove cooperation worked or confirm skeptics' doubts. But tonight they had this: partnership tested and proven, bond claimed and honored, future uncertain but faced together. Garrett and Kira left the training room, walking side by side through corridors that belonged to both species. Past crew members, Human and Calathar, who'd learned to work together because two strangers had refused to let governments write the ending. The bridge between stars wasn't complete, might never be, but it existed, real, functional, growing stronger with each day they chose to build rather than burn. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes possibility mattered more than certainty. Sometimes two people choosing each other changed everything. Until stars fade, until the work was done, until partnership became so natural that the universe forgot it had once seemed impossible. They walked together into whatever came next. Ready.